When the Pinecrest Gardens HOA blocked my entire driveway with 5 massive shipping containers, they had no idea they had just declared war on their own landlord. How would they react when they discovered the quiet homeowner they'd been harassing for months actually owned the very building where they collected their precious HOA fees? I nearly spat out my coffee when I looked out my front window. 5 giant metal shipping containers sat in my driveway, blocking my garage completely. My car was trapped inside, and I had a meeting in 40 minutes. "What the heck is this?" I shouted to no one, rushing outside in my bathrobe and slippers. The containers were massive, rusty blue metal boxes stacked nearly to the second floor of my house. My neighbor, Diane, stood in her yard, watering her plants with a smug smile on her face. She wore her usual outfit: beige pants, a crisp white blouse, and that gold HOA president pin she never took off. "Morning, James," she called, way too cheerful. "Quite the surprise, isn't it?" I stormed toward her, pointing at the metal wall blocking my driveway. "Did you do this? How am I supposed to get to work?" Diane put her watering can down slowly, like she was savoring the moment. "The Pinecrest Gardens HOA voted last week. These containers are being stored here temporarily. We sent notices to everyone." "I never got any notice," I snapped, checking my phone for missed emails. "Nothing." "Well, that's strange. Everyone else received theirs." She shrugged. "Maybe check your spam folder. Anyway, it's just for a few months." "Months?" Voice cracked. "This is completely insane. You can't just block someone's driveway." "Actually, we can," she said smugly. "It's in the HOA agreement, Section 12.3. Temporary use of common spaces for community improvement projects. Your driveway extends onto community property by exactly 4 feet. "That's not true." "We measured yesterday." She pointed to faint chalk marks on the pavement. "Richard and Karen confirmed it." Of course they did. Richard and Karen, Diane's 2 favorite HOA committee members, who spent their retirement measuring grass height and counting how many Christmas lights people put up. "This is ridiculous. I'm calling a tow truck," I said, reaching for my phone. Diane's smile faded. "That would violate HOA rules. You'll be fined $500 per container moved without permission." She turned back toward her house. "Board meeting tonight at 7. You're welcome to file a complaint then." I stood there in my slippers, fuming. 5 years of living in Pinecrest Gardens. 5 years of petty rules and power trips. Last month, my mailbox was non-regulation blue. The month before that, my bird feeder was attracting non-approved wildlife. Inside, I called my boss to explain I'd be working from home. Then, I phoned every towing company in town. None would touch the containers without HOA approval. At noon, my doorbell rang. It was Mrs. Patel from across the street, holding a casserole dish. "I brought lunch," she said quietly. "I saw what they did. It's not right." Mrs. Patel was the neighborhood grandma. She had lived here for 30 years, long before the HOA even existed. We sat at my kitchen table while I explained my predicament. "Diane's been after me since I moved in," I said between bites of amazing butter chicken. "But this? This is next level." "She does this," Mrs. Patel nodded. "Picks one person each year to make an example of. Last year, it was the Millers. Their son's basketball hoop was unsightly. They moved away." "Well, I'm not moving," I said firmly. "I've worked too hard for this house." After Mrs. Patel left, I dug through my home office for my property documents. The HOA agreement was thicker than a phone book. As I flipped through endless pages of rules, my phone dinged with an email notification. It was from my property management company. Monthly rent collection summary. Westland Commercial Properties. I clicked it open absently, still reading the HOA rules. The list of businesses that paid rent to my company scrolled by. Near the bottom, one name made me stop breathing for a second. Pinecrest Gardens Homeowners Association. Wait, what? I scrolled back up. There it was. The HOA rented their office space in a small commercial building nearby, a building I had purchased through my company, Westland Properties, 8 years ago as an investment. The same company that sent the rent statement I was looking at. I laughed so hard tears came to my eyes. The HOA had no idea. They were renting from me. I had bought the property through my LLC, and my property manager handled everything. They had no clue that James Reynolds and Westland Properties were the same person. My phone buzzed with a text from Karen. Your garden gnomes exceed height restrictions by 2.3 inches. A $150 fine will be added to your HOA dues. I walked to my window and looked at the shipping containers. Then, at my poor garden gnomes, who had apparently committed the crime of being too tall. Shaking my head, I turned to my laptop and checked the HOA's lease details. Their lease renewal was due in exactly 27 days. The 7 p.m. HOA meeting tonight would be interesting. Very interesting indeed. I straightened my tie in the mirror before leaving for the community center. For once, I was actually looking forward to an HOA meeting. Walking was my only option, thanks to my imprisoned car. Along the way, some neighbors gave me sympathetic looks, while others quickly averted their eyes, afraid to be seen showing support. The community center was packed. I spotted Diane at the front table with Richard and Karen, all shuffling important-looking papers. Karen's gray bob haircut was so stiff it didn't move when she nodded at something Richard whispered to her. I took a seat in the back row. Mrs. Patel gave me a small wave from across the room. Let's call this meeting to order, Diane announced, tapping her gavel unnecessarily. First item, the new container storage project. A slideshow appeared on the wall. Pinecrest Gardens Community Enhancement Initiative. The first slide featured a stock photo of happy people in a park. As you know, Diane continued, we've entered an exciting partnership with Loytrans Shipping. They're paying us $2,000 per month to store containers temporarily on community property. Richard stood up. This income will fund our new decorative street signs and additional surveillance cameras. A man in the front row raised his hand. Where exactly are these containers being stored? There was a brief pause. Then, someone else spoke up. There are 5 of them blocking James Reynolds' driveway. All eyes turned to me. Karen cleared her throat and read from her clipboard. Mr. Reynolds' driveway extends 4 feet onto common property. According to Section 12.3, I measured my property line this afternoon, I interrupted. My driveway is fully within my property boundaries. Karen's face flushed. Our measurements were wrong, I finished. I have my original property survey right here. I held up the document. Nothing in the HOA agreement allows you to block access to my home. Diane cleared her throat. We've determined it's temporary community storage space. You've determined? I asked, standing up now. Was there a vote on specifically using my driveway? The room grew uncomfortable. Mrs. Peterson from 2 doors down spoke up. I don't remember voting on whose driveway would be blocked. It was an executive decision, Richard said, his voice hardening. Sometimes leadership requires making tough choices. I walked slowly to the front of the room. Let me understand this. You've signed a deal to make money by storing containers, and you're putting them in front of my house without my permission. The needs of the community outweigh individual inconvenience, Diane said firmly. This benefits everyone, I replied. Except me. I can't use my garage. I can't access my car. Karen sniffed. Perhaps you should carpool until the project is complete. Murmurs rippled through the room. Even some HOA supporters looked uncomfortable. How long will the containers be there? Someone asked. 6 to 8 months, Richard answered. The room erupted. Even for rule-following Pinecrest Gardens, this was too much. I raised my hand until the noise settled. I have a question. Diane nodded reluctantly. Go ahead. Does everyone here know who owns the building where the HOA office is located? Confusion spread across the room. Karen glanced at Diane, who frowned. Westland Properties is our landlord, she stated. Why is that relevant? I smiled, feeling a strange calm come over me. Just wondering if you've met the owner, since your lease is up for renewal next month. Diane's eyes narrowed. We deal with a management company. This is completely off topic, Mr. Reynolds. Is it? I took out my business card and placed it on their table. James Reynolds, CEO, Westland Properties, LLC. The room went so quiet, you could hear the air conditioning hum. Karen picked up the card, her hand trembling slightly. I had posted photos of my blocked driveway online, and by morning, the story had gone viral. By noon, the HOA's phone was ringing off the hook. I knew this because Karen called me, her voice tight with anger. "What have you done?" she hissed. "We're getting calls from all over the country." "I didn't call the media," I said truthfully. "Maybe someone at the meeting last night did. This is damaging our community's reputation." She insisted. "You need to tell them it's being resolved." "Is it?" I asked. "Because there are still 5 shipping containers blocking my driveway." She hung up on me. At 2 p.m., my lawyer, Samantha, arrived, stepping carefully around the news crews in her immaculate suit. "Well," she said once we were inside, "you've certainly caused a stir." I showed her the property documents and the HOA lease. "What can they actually do? Can they really block my driveway like this?" She adjusted her glasses, reviewing the paperwork. "Not legally, no. They're violating local ordinances about emergency access for starters. So I can have them towed." "Yes," she said, tapping her pen thoughtfully. "But you have something much more interesting here. With the building lease, their renewal is coming up, and as the landlord, you have considerable leverage." "I don't want to evict them," I admitted. "I just want them to stop the power trips and remove these containers." Samantha smiled. "Then let's draft some new lease terms." As she typed on her laptop, Mrs. Patel knocked on my back door, sneaking through yards to avoid the media. "James," she whispered. "It's chaos. Diane called an emergency HOA meeting for tonight. They're saying you orchestrated this whole media circus to embarrass them." I sighed. "I didn't call any reporters, did you?" She grinned mischievously. "My grandson might have posted something on that TikTok thing. He has many followers." I laughed. "Mrs. Patel causing trouble with social media? Who would have guessed? There's more," she continued, lowering her voice. "Lloyd Trans Shipping called Diane. They don't want bad publicity and are threatening to cancel their container contract." That explained the commotion I'd heard from Diane's house earlier, what sounded like a vase smashing against a wall. After Mrs. Patel left, Samantha finished drafting our proposal. "This gives them 2 options," she explained. "Either they keep their office space under new terms, or they find somewhere else to rent within 30 days. The new terms were simple: immediate removal of the containers, a public apology, changes to the HOA board structure to prevent future abuses of power, a rewrite of some of the more ridiculous rules. It's reasonable, not vindictive," Samantha assured me. "Courts would view this favorably if they try to fight it." As evening approached, the media circus grew. Someone had even ordered pizzas for the reporters, who were now camped out on the sidewalk. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. Calls from neighbors, news outlets, and even a Hollywood producer interested in option rights to my story. I dressed carefully for the emergency meeting. Business casual, nothing flashy. The last thing I wanted was to look like I was gloating. Walking toward the community center, I noticed Richard taking photos of my house from different angles. When he saw me, he quickly pocketed his phone and hurried away. The meeting room was packed beyond capacity. People from neighboring communities had shown up after seeing the news. Diane, Richard, and Karen sat at the front, looking grim. Diane called for order, her voice strained. "This emergency session will address the current situation with the storage containers and the resulting media attention, which Mr. Reynolds orchestrated," Karen interjected, pointing at me. Several people booed. I was surprised by the support. "I didn't contact any media," I stated calmly, "but the containers are real, and they're illegally blocking my property." Richard stood, holding up photos. "We have documentation proving the containers are on community property." He flipped to another slide. "And we have satellite images showing your fence extends beyond your property line by nearly 2 feet. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. They were trying to flip the script to make me the rule breaker. I looked at the photos. Those are doctored. My property line was professionally surveyed just last year. Convenient claim. Karen sniffed. Do you have proof? A voice from the doorway cut through the tension. Actually, they said, stepping into the room. I do. Everyone turned to see Mr. Goldstein, the county surveyor, standing in the doorway, holding official-looking maps. Few in the neighborhood knew that he'd been my poker buddy for years. James asked me to verify his property boundaries this morning. Mr. Goldstein announced, unrolling a large map onto the center table. The room leaned in as he pointed. Not only is his driveway completely within his property, but the HOA has actually encroached on his land by placing these containers here, here, and here. Richard's face turned red. This is just your friend helping you, he snapped. I remained calm. Mr. Goldstein is the county's official surveyor, I replied. Are you questioning his professional integrity? The room grew tense. Diane whispered urgently to Karen, who was frantically texting someone. I folded my arms. Furthermore, I continued, I've had my lawyer review the HOA agreement. Nothing in it permits blocking access to a resident's home, regardless of property lines. Diane's voice was tight. We had no choice. The LOI trans contract required specific placement. Mrs. Peterson, a longtime resident, scoffed. So you prioritized money over a homeowner's access to their property? A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The mood in the room was shifting, and the HOA board could feel it. Karen stood up, her voice shrill. This meeting is about Mr. Reynolds' vindictive attempt to damage our community's reputation, she snapped. He's threatening our HOA office lease over a personal vendetta. I kept my voice even. I haven't threatened anything, but as your landlord, I am concerned about how the HOA is being run. Richard slammed a hand on the table. You became our landlord in secret, he shouted. You never disclosed this conflict of interest. I let out a short laugh. There was no conflict until you blocked my driveway. The room stirred. I've been a hands-off landlord for 8 years, I continued. The property management company handles everything. At that moment, Samantha stepped forward, handing copies of our proposal to the board. My client is offering reasonable terms for lease renewal, she said smoothly. Diane, Richard, and Karen scanned the documents, their expressions darkening. This is blackmail, Diane hissed. Samantha's smile didn't falter. It's negotiation. My client has no obligation to renew your lease under the previous terms. The crowd murmured, trying to grasp the weight of the situation. Mrs. Patel stood up, her gentle voice carrying through the room. Perhaps we should all see these new terms. Since this affects our whole community? Samantha nodded, passing out more copies. As people read, excited conversations filled the room. Elimination of fines for minor infractions. Board elections every year instead of every 5 years. Rules can be changed by community vote. Not just the board. The energy shifted. Many residents had suffered under the current HOA regime, but had been too intimidated to speak up. Until now. Diane banged her gavel. This is outrageous, she barked. He can't dictate how our HOA operates just because he owns the building. Samantha tilted her head. Actually, he's not dictating anything. She gestured to the lease proposal. He's offering a lease renewal with conditions. You're free to find another location, if you prefer. A voice called from the back. How much are we paying for rent anyway? And where does that money come from? The room stilled. Diane paled. HOA financial records were supposed to be transparent, but suddenly, many residents realized they'd never actually seen them. Just then, the doors burst open. A man in a Lloydtrans shipping uniform stormed in, furious. Which one of you is Diane Mercer? He demanded. Diane hesitated. Your containers need to be moved immediately. His voice boomed across the room. This PR nightmare is violating our contract terms. Chaos erupted. Karen's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen, then whispered urgently to Diane and Richard. Their faces fell simultaneously. I watched them huddle, whispering in frantic conversation. Finally, Diane straightened and approached me. Her forced smile was painful to watch. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately," she said, gesturing toward a side room. I shook my head. "I'm happy to talk here. Transparency seems overdue in Pinecrest Gardens." Karen leaned in, her voice low and urgent. "The city inspector just called." Her hands gripped the edge of the table. "They're issuing citations for the containers. Apparently, they violate multiple codes and were placed without proper permits." I let that sink in. "Which you knew," I said, realization dawning. "That's why you didn't go through official channels." Richard looked away guiltily. Diane's composure finally cracked. "Fine," she spat. "We'll move the containers." She squared her shoulders. "But your lease demands are still unreasonable." I smiled. "Then we still have a problem." I glanced around the room at neighbors openly discussing years of HOA overreach. "I don't think they find them unreasonable," I said. "But here's another option. I'll sell the building." The board members looked confused. "To the HOA," I clarified. "At a fair market price, with reasonable financing. Then you won't have a landlord to worry about." Karen gasped. "We can't afford to buy a building." Mrs. Patel tilted her head innocently. "With the money you've collected in excessive fines over the years? And the $2,000 monthly container fee?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Diane. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into her palms. She leaned in, her voice a whisper just loud enough for me to hear. "This isn't over. You have no idea what you've started." As the meeting descended into chaos, discussions of financial audits and emergency board elections, the Loytrans representative approached me. "Your driveway should be clear by morning," he said. "And between us, we're canceling our contract with these people. Too much drama." I nodded, grateful, but something felt off. Through the window, I spotted Richard, standing outside, making a heated phone call. When he noticed me watching, he turned away quickly. Samantha touched my arm. "Great result. But stay vigilant. People like this don't surrender power easily." Walking home, the weight of victory felt heavier than I expected. The shipping containers would be gone soon, but something told me I'd just traded one problem for something worse. As I neared my house, something odd caught my eye. A small red dot dancing across my front door before vanishing. I froze. "Probably kids with laser pointers," I told myself. But when I reached my porch, I found a note taped to my door. "Property records work both ways. I wonder what secrets Westland Properties is hiding." A chill ran through me. I thought of the filing cabinet in my office. The one containing documents on all my properties, including some purchases that, while legal, wouldn't look good if made public. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. The battle for Pinecrest Gardens had just entered a dangerous new phase. Diane continued proudly. "Thanks to our partnership with Loytrans Shipping, we've secured $50,000 by allowing temporary container storage on community property." Murmurs spread through the room. Mrs. Patel raised her hand. "But those containers are blocking James's driveway completely." Karen clutched her clipboard. "Mr. Reynolds's inconvenience is unfortunate, but necessary for community progress. Perhaps if he attended more meetings, he'd understand our vision." "I wasn't notified about these meetings," I said calmly. "Notices were sent," Richard snapped. "Not our fault if you don't check your mail." Diane nodded. "We're improving property values for everyone. The containers stay for 6 months, per our contract." I raised my hand. Diane pointedly ignored me until several neighbors gestured at her. She sighed dramatically. "Yes, Mr. Reynolds?" "I'd like to understand the legal basis for blocking access to my property," I said, "especially since it appears the decision was made without a proper quorum or notification, according to Section 5 of our bylaws." Karen's eyes narrowed. "Are you threatening legal action?" "I'm just asking questions." I shrugged. "For instance, did you know that the Pinecrest Gardens HOA office is owned by Westland Properties LLC? Confused murmurs rippled through the board members. Diane scoffed. "What does that have to do with anything?" I stood, walking to the front of the room. I'd like to introduce myself properly, I said. I'm James Reynolds, founder and CEO of Westland Properties, LLC. The room went silent. You're our landlord, someone whispered. I placed my business card on the table in front of Diane. And I've brought some proposed changes to your lease renewal next month. Diane's face drained of color. Her mouth opened and closed, unable to form words. This is, she stammered. A coincidence? I offered. Not really. Just interesting timing that you chose to target the person who owns your building. I glanced around the room, watching realization spread across their faces. Now, about those containers. Karen's voice echoed through the parking lot as rain drizzled down, matching the stormy mood. You planned this all along, she accused. I closed my umbrella, offering it to Mrs. Patel as she hurried to her car. Actually, I had no idea until my lawyer discovered the connection yesterday, I said calmly. I've been a hands-off landlord. Richard jabbed a finger at my chest. This is extortion. You're using your position to force changes. I stepped back. I prefer to call it leverage. Diane joined us, her perfectly styled hair wilting in the rain. You'll regret this, she hissed. We have a binding contract with Loytrans. Show me the contract, I said. Let everyone see exactly what you signed. She hesitated, glancing at Karen. That's what I thought, I continued. My lawyer will contact you tomorrow with terms for your lease renewal. I handed her a folder. Among them, removal of all containers within 24 hours, new HOA board elections with independent oversight, and a complete revision of how rules are enforced. Richard sneered. Or what? Or I'll find new tenants when your lease expires next month. I met his glare. I'm not threatening anything illegal, just business. My phone buzzed. A text from Samantha. Outside now. Important. I excused myself, finding her waiting by her car. James, there's more, she said urgently. I checked the easement records. Those containers aren't just annoying. They're illegal. I raised an eyebrow. How illegal? They're blocking a fire access route, no permits either. Who would I report that to? I asked. Samantha grinned. Already called the fire marshal. Inspections at 9 a.m. For the first time in days, I slept easily. At 6 a.m., my doorbell rang repeatedly. I opened it to find Diane, makeup-free, wild-eyed, and frantic. We need to talk, she said, pushing past me into my living room. Your lease terms are impossible. I smirked. Coffee? Stop playing games, Diane snapped. Loytrans already paid us. We spent half the money on the playground equipment. I filled my coffee pot, unfazed. That sounds like a you problem. You don't understand what you're doing. She stepped closer. I've built this community into something special. Property values have increased 40% under my leadership. By bullying people over garden gnomes and mailboxes? I asked. Diane collapsed onto my couch, suddenly looking much older. You have no idea what it takes to maintain standards, she muttered. People would paint their houses purple and park boats in their yards if I let them. Maybe that's their right. Her eyes flashed. Then why even have an HOA? I smirked. Good question. By 8:30 a.m., a small crowd had gathered near my driveway. Word of the fire marshal's visit had spread through the neighborhood. Mrs. Patel handed out coffee from a thermos, chatting with neighbors. Even Richard stood awkwardly apart from the others. At 9 o'clock sharp, a white SUV with official markings pulled up. Fire Marshal Rodriguez stepped out, clipboard in hand. What's going on here? He asked, eyeing the shipping containers. Karen rushed forward before I could speak. These are temporary storage units approved by our homeowners association, she said breathlessly. All completely legal and proper. Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. Do you have permits? Karen froze. Well, they're temporary. Rodriguez pointed to small markers on the ground. Blocking a fire lane. He jotted something down. No hazardous material signage either. That's 3 violations. Diane swallowed hard. We can move them. Rodriguez nodded. Immediately. And there will be fines. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Check your email. Now it was from Marcus, a quiet neighbor I barely knew. I opened the email. Screenshots flooded my screen. Private HOA board messages. They had deliberately targeted my property after I questioned a fine months ago. The messages even called it a lesson. I turned my screen toward Samantha. She whistled. That's harassment and potentially illegal. You could sue them personally, not just the HOA. The first tow truck lifted a container, revealing my garage door for the first time in days. Neighbors clapped. Richard approached hesitantly. James, can we talk? I followed him to the edge of my property. He rubbed the back of his neck, looking uncomfortable. Look, I know how this seems, but Diane and Karen, they have something on everyone on the board. I frowned. Blackmail? Richard shook his head. Control. Old violations. Special exceptions they granted. They built a system to keep people in line. I crossed my arms. So why tell me this now? He sighed heavily. Because someone needs to stop them, and you're the only one who can. That evening, as the last container disappeared down the street, my phone rang non-stop, neighbors sharing their HOA horror stories. Mrs. Patel had organized an impromptu gathering on my lawn. We should have stood up to them years ago, she admitted. Neighbors nodded. Not anymore, Marcus said firmly. As darkness settled, Diane's car pulled up. She stepped out alone, her movements hesitant. She walked slowly up my porch steps. The board has decided to resign, she said, voice tired. She held out a folder with trembling hands. Effective immediately. I took it without opening it. That's a start. Diane looked lost. What happens now? I leaned against the railing, staring out at the neighborhood. That's up to the community, not just you, not just me. Her jaw tensed. And the HOA office lease? I smiled. I think I'll attend the next meeting to discuss that. I met her eyes. A properly notified, fully transparent meeting, with all neighbors welcome. She nodded stiffly, then turned, walking away into the night. My phone buzzed again. Check your security cameras from last night. You'll want to see who was snooping around your property at 2 a.m. A new twist in this neighborhood power struggle. I stared at the message, my stomach tightening. Then, a soft knock on my door. Mrs. Patel stood on my doorstep, holding a tray of homemade samosas. You're fighting the HOA alone. That's not right, she said, her eyes determined behind her glasses. My home should feel like mine after 30 years here. Her words sparked an idea. What if we talk to everyone? Not a formal meeting, just neighbors. Honest conversations. Word spread quickly. By Sunday afternoon, my backyard filled with families who had never spoken beyond polite waves. Children chased each other through sprinklers, while adults gathered in a loose circle of lawn chairs. I've never hosted an HOA rebellion before, I joked, breaking the ice. But I think we all have stories to share. Hands shot up immediately. They fined me $200 for planting tomatoes, Marcus said, his voice shaking. Called them unauthorized vegetation. My rainbow flag disappeared 3 times, added Elena. The third time, Karen left a note about appropriate displays. One by one, neighbors revealed years of frustration, denied garden expansions, fights over holiday decorations, arbitrary fines. The previous board hadn't created a community. They'd created fear. So, what exactly do we want instead? Eric, who had moved in last month, asked. I smiled. What if we focused on safety and thoughtfulness instead of control? Rules that help rather than restrict. But who decides those rules? Someone called out. What stops new leaders from becoming just like the old ones? The yard fell silent. Then, Marcus's teenage daughter spoke up. What if everyone gets a turn, and nobody can be in charge for too long? Her simple suggestion opened the floodgates. We drafted plans, rotating positions, clear voting procedures, limits on fines and enforcement. As darkness fell, neighbors lingered, chatting, not just about HOA rules, but real conversations. Maybe for the first time in years. Later that night, my phone buzzed. Karen. I never meant to become the neighborhood villain. The power changed me, changed all of us. I stared at her words. Sincere? Or just another manipulation? The next morning, I woke to the rumble of trucks. A crew was unloading wheelbarrows and shovels at the common area. Richard directed them toward the shipping containers, where workers were cutting open one side. What's happening? I asked. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Community garden project. The board approved it last night. I raised an eyebrow. The containers were going to be scrapped anyway. He hesitated. It wasn't my idea. I followed his gaze to Karen, standing by the workers, hands on her hips. The seasons changed. Our neighborhood transformed. Gone were the threatening HOA newsletters, replaced by community updates full of garden tips and babysitting exchanges. The shipping containers, once symbols of conflict, now housed thriving vegetable beds. On a warm Saturday, I spotted Karen kneeling in the dirt beside Mrs. Patel, both laughing as they compared tomato plants. Seeing them together still surprised me. They've become gardening buddies, Marcus said, leaning against the fence. Never thought I'd see Karen with dirty hands by choice. Change hadn't come easily. Diane moved away within weeks. Richard stayed, but remained distant, watching our community experiments from the sidelines. The most remarkable shift came from Karen. After her late-night message, she showed up at every volunteer day, working twice as hard as anyone else. One evening, as we repainted the community center sign, I finally asked, "Why the complete turnaround?" Karen set down her brush. "My sister stopped speaking to me," she admitted. "She visited last spring, saw how I treated neighbors, and called me a small-town dictator." Her voice cracked. I didn't recognize myself in her description, but she was right. Our biggest test came at the yearly budget meeting. As a property owner, I could have forced decisions. Instead, I sat quietly among my neighbors. When disagreements flared, people listened. Remember when these meetings ended with someone storming out crying? Eric whispered beside me. The biggest surprise came afterward. Richard approached me and extended his hand. "I fought against you because I thought rules made a neighborhood good," he admitted. "I was wrong. It's the people." 6 months after the container blockade, our summer block party spilled across front yards. No property debates. Children ran freely between houses, their parents no longer worried about HOA violations. Mrs. Patel's door remained proudly purple. The Johnsons' wheelchair ramp stood sturdy and unpermitted. My garden gnomes, all 12 of them, stood guard over my flower beds. As sunset painted the sky, neighbors gathered for an impromptu concert. Elena's teenage band played while adults spread blankets on lawns. Karen sat down beside me, offering a plate of cookies. "My grandmother's recipe," she said. "I've never shared it before." I raised an eyebrow. "Why now?" She looked around at our mismatched, imperfect, vibrant community. "Because some things are better when shared." I took a bite. Perfectly sweet, just a little messy. Like Pinecrest Gardens itself. Sometimes the worst conflicts lead to the best communities. And sometimes 5 shipping containers blocking your driveway might just be the beginning of something beautiful.